around here, one of many pastors who gets to call this place home. I love this church. I love what God's been up to, and I am so glad you are with us for what we're calling a launch gathering, which is to say, as Jake was explaining, in 2 weeks, we start a new chapter in what God began at LifeBridge, and now will continue on as we become 242 Community Church, one of 7 locations. And what's great about that story, and any of you who don't know me or maybe some of my stories, like I started just attending 242 Community Church over 14 years ago when they were just over a year old themselves. I came, my now 15-year-old was just like this little punk thing that we had that we were trying to figure out. We've had 2 more kids since then, and we just served, attended, and loved this church for years. And then my wife and I came on staff over 11 years ago now when we launched the Ann Arbor campus. And so we moved to Ann Arbor and we started that campus, and we've got to just be a part of this story of what God does. What that started in one place in Brighton, then continued in Ann Arbor, now is in Lansing and Saginaw, Livonia, Monroe, and right here. And it's just fun to be a part of. And when people hear stuff about 242, like if you've been around, you've been learning, or if you're brand new, sometimes we can miss the real like amazing part of the story. Because sometimes we hear like, oh man, there's 7 campuses. That's crazy. Or this weekend, there'll be over 10,000 people worshiping across our 7 campuses. And sometimes people hear that, and it's like, man, that's incredible. But the truth is, that is only half of the story. That's only the collective gathered when we all come together. Because it's fun, we can admit it. When we gather in a room and there's hundreds of us, there's this energy and this feeling of like, man, we're a part of something bigger. And so it's fun to come together and to worship together and to be the church in a gathered space like this. But if we're not careful, we can begin to believe that the church is this, that the church is a building, that the church has bowling lanes, or the church is when fancy people sing songs that we can't, or the church is when there's a bunch of us, or when we're together, or when we attend something on the weekend. But that is not true. The church is you, and it's me. And there are these amazing fun moments where we all gather together like this. But when we leave here, we are no longer at church, and we are not the church, like not the church when we leave here. You and I are the church when we gather, and we are the church when we scatter. Let me show you how we try to kind of map this out for you so you can kind of see where you are, where maybe some of your next steps are, but also why, kind of how we try to organize ourselves to be the fullness of the church that Jesus calls us to be. So we call it the 9. The 9 has these 3 rows and these 3 columns and these 9 things kind of simply set, kind of a map for you and I to be formed into the people in the church that Jesus wants us to be. The top row, we use this word celebrate. The middle, this word connect. The bottom, the word contribute. You notice along the top that it says our mission statement as a church is to help people take their next steps with God. Whether this is your very first time in church or this is your 1,000th time in church, we want to help you continue to take next steps with God. And no matter how professional or smart at church stuff you might be, or completely first novice, feel like you don't even belong, all of us actually are on the same level playing field. Yes, some of us might be a little farther down the journey, but we're all on the same playing field, and we all have a next step to take every time we gather, every day we wake up. Everything we do is built upon the foundation of the Bible. We spend a number of weeks, if you missed them, you can go listen to them online, that just establish why we view Scripture as the very words of Jesus. We try to have the same relationship with the Bible that Jesus had. We see it as authoritative and as trustworthy, and the foundation upon which we stand that guides and leads us as a community. Now, those 3 words, celebrate, connect, contribute, that create that kind of chart for us, really are just a simple way of understanding the 3 relationships we all have to live into as we follow Jesus. Celebrate is this idea of our relationship vertically with God. How do we know Him? How do we relate with Him? How do we follow Him? That middle row, connect, is how we relate with each other as the church, that we would be connected to each other. And the bottom row, contribute, is how we relate to the world around us, in particular those who do not believe as we believe about Jesus. How do we interact with the world around us? What has Jesus called us to do? And you can very simply and easily assess your own. It's like the alignment of a car. When your alignment's out and the car's shaking, you know something's wrong and you got to get it fixed. If there's ever a moment in your spiritual journey where you just feel like you don't know what's next or something's not right, you can assess yourself. Where are you in relation with God? Where are you in relationship with this church? Are there people who know you and know your story? And then where are you in relation to serving other people in the world around you? So let me build for you real quick the 9. It's simple. The first is what we do here on the weekends when we gather. We gather to collectively worship, pray, and focus on the scriptures. We make these weekends very intentionally the kinds of places where whether it's your first time or your 1,000th time in church, it will make sense and there'll be something that you can apply, something that you can go and try to like live into, whether you believe all the claims of Christianity or the Bible or Jesus or not. Church, regardless of who's leading the songs or who is teaching on the weekends, is a place we want you to always feel safe and comfortable to invite your friends who think church is lame to come try to experience something different. Those are the weekends. Now, all of us typically begin our relationship with the church by attending on the weekend. Every one of us needs a clear moment that we just call baptism, a moment where we make a decision of what it is we believe about Jesus and choose to then begin a lifelong journey of following him in obedience. That all leads to kind of a third expression of our relationship with God that we call daily encounter. That while we come here to encounter God corporately, you and I should encounter him daily. You and I should be people who are reading his word and hearing from him and growing in our personal relationship with God. That is the top row. The middle row, connect, begins with what we call next step groups. This is the best first step to take if you're new around here. It's groups like Financial Peace University to help you like figure out some just practical stuff in your life. The best one is called Rooted. We'll be talking about it more in the coming weeks for you to kind of experience what being part of a church community means. If you only ever attend on the weekend, you have not even scratched the surface of what community is all about. Those next step groups lead into what we call small groups. This is the ongoing, take what's taught about on the weekend Sunday sermons and just talk about them more and be in relationship with people who you give permission to really know you. And every one of us should get to a place where we have what we call a coaching group, where we have someone who's a few next steps ahead of us that we have given permission to coach us, which is give permission to be in our business a little bit, to challenge us to really become the men and the women that God has created us to be. Now, the bottom row is what I want to focus our attention on today as kind of the foundation of how we take all that we believe about Jesus and all that we do collectively as the church on the weekends and in small groups and live that out. The first word that we put on there is team. Really, one of the best ways for you to grow in your relationship with God is to just sign up and serve on a team and begin to be part of the church, not just in attendance, but in being a practitioner of it. And then the next step is what we call tithe. It's this idea of generosity. You will hear us talk about generosity over and over and over again. A team is about learning to be generous with your time. Your tithe is learning to be generous with your money. It's about beginning to put God first and his priorities of other people ahead of ourselves, and that every one of us always has steps to take in how we serve others and how we give of our resources and trust in God. And that leads to the final block, which we just call go, be. You will hear us say it all of the time when we wrap up services. Now go and be the church where you live, where you work, and where you play, because you are the church. And we don't want this to be the only expression of church in your life if we're really going to become all that Jesus wants us to be. Let's think of it like this. When you hear the word church, what is it? Like the church equals what? Now, if you're new around church, I'll give you a really easy kind of like tip. Anytime anyone asks any question in church, if you just say Jesus, you're partially right, okay? So church is Jesus plus something. Jesus, what he taught, what he did, what we believe about his death and his resurrection, plus what makes us the church. And I'm going to illustrate this to you by taking a little walk through a book in the New Testament called Acts. When you come to Scripture, the New Testament has three main parts. The first part are 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The church word for them is the gospel accounts. What they are just biographies about the life of Jesus, his teachings, what he did, why it was important, and what happened. Then there's the book of Acts. Then following Acts are a bunch of letters written by the early church leaders that helped them organize and guide the church then, and they still organize and guide the church today. But the book of Acts sits unique in that it is not a biography of the life of Jesus, nor is it written by a church leader to a church. The book of Acts is a historic account. It is written by the same guy, Luke, that wrote what we call the Gospel of Luke. Luke set out to write the history and the story of Jesus. We call that the Gospel of Luke. And then he wrote the book of Acts, which is after Jesus' death and after his resurrection. How did those who put their faith in him begin to organize what we now call the movement of Christianity, the church? And so I want you to see what happens as people took what Jesus did and began to go do what he did and ask them to do what transpired. So we'll start in Acts chapter 1. I'll just put a bunch of verses up here. Just read them along with me. In verse 15, it says, "In those days, Peter," that was one of Jesus' closest friends, "stood up among the believers We were a group numbering about 120. So the beginning of the church was kind of small. There was just about 120 of them in Jerusalem. They were all super confused by everything that had happened. Jesus died. That was super confusing. Then he came back. No one had a context for that. Then he left again. Like, it was just very discombobulating. There's about 120 of them. Flip over to Acts chapter 2, verse 41. It says this: those who accepted his message, meaning put their faith in Jesus, and were baptized, about 3,000 of them were added to their number that day. So what started a chapter earlier, about 120, now is over 3,000 people in a single day. Pretty amazing growth as the church was becoming the church. Just a couple verses later in Acts 2:47, it said, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So like at least one person every day, like 365 people a year, were beginning to profess their faith in Jesus and follow him and become part of what we now know as the church. A couple chapters later, in chapter 4, verse 4, it says, but many who heard the message of Jesus, believed. So the number of men, just the men who believed, grew to about 5,000. So you added women, about 10,000. You had those who had already followed. Like, the church is beginning to push 15 or 20,000 people as it's gaining momentum and accelerating, and more people are being influenced by what has transpired. One chapter later, chapter 5, verse 14 says, nevertheless, more and more men and women believed in the Lord and were added to their number. Now they're like, we can't even count anymore. There's just so many people. It just keeps growing. This thing is crazy. A couple verses later in Acts 5, verse 28, one of the religious authority who was scolding the church leaders for continuing to talk about Jesus, though they were given strict orders not to do that anymore, said, we gave you strict orders not to teach his name, yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching. Like, what they were doing is they continued to grow. Like, half the city of Jerusalem was beginning to convert. Everyone was familiar with this teaching and this proclamation that Jesus was more than a rabbi and a man, that he died, that he didn't stay dead, and thousands upon thousands of people are putting their faith in him. One chapter later, chapter 6 opens up and says, in those days when the number of disciples was increasing, Luke has given up on trying to count it. It is just exponentially growing, and no longer just in Jerusalem, but it's beginning to spread. Down to verse 7 of chapter 6, it says that, so the word of God spread, the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and even a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. It just keeps growing. Now jump all the way to Acts chapter 20, and now this is spread around the known world through what Rome was, Rome's empire. And it says, when they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed. The movement of Christianity, the response to becoming the church, of taking what we believe about Jesus, began to just continue to grow and continue to grow. And you and I, we all sit here today. You got to think about how important this is. Those are just the moments within a couple of decades of Jesus' death and resurrection. Now thousands, millions, generation after hundreds and hundreds of years, you and I sit here as the next link in the chain of what it is to be the church. You and I are today who they were then. There's an opportunity in front of you and I to become and embody what has changed history. So let me give you the simple answer. Church is Jesus plus his mission. When we take what we believe about Jesus, and then we go and do what he called us to do, when we go and start to become as he was, follow the example that he had, as we go and share the message of Jesus to the people around us, we become the church. We are not the church because we gathered just simply around our belief in Jesus. We are the church when we take what we believe about him and we go and do something with it. As it changes us personally, as it changes the way we lead and live our life and our homes, it should spill over into the places where we live, where we work, where we play, because we are the church every day, everywhere we go. It is Jesus plus his mission that makes us church. So how did they do it? So that you and I might do it the same. If you've ever wondered where our church name 242 comes from, it comes from the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 2, verse 42 through 47, it's the namesake of our church, and we want to be a new church like the first church was, what they did. Let's just do that, and let's keep trying to play our part in the story of Jesus' mission. So let me just show you these two verses in the middle of that section. You should read the whole thing later, but I only have time for this. So here's these two verses for you in the middle of where our church name comes from. It says, this is how they did it. All the believers were together, so they'd gather like this, and they had everything in common. Like they were just like, hey, whatever I got, you got. And so they sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. They embodied, as they saw Jesus, a radical kind of lifestyle and generosity that said, whatever I have is for you. So if I have time, I want to give it to help you. If I have money and you don't have enough, I want to give it to help you. If I have something that I don't really need, I'll sell it so I can use it to help more people. And not just the you who are in the room, but you, anyone, anywhere that God might use us as a church to influence and point them to His grace and to His truth. See, what we're inviting people to do is not just interact with, like in an academic sense, who Jesus was and what He taught. What we are inviting people to interact with is people who are trying to embody Him. See, the hope of the world is Jesus Christ, but more specifically, it's that they would see Him in you. They would see Him in your response, in your priorities, in your lifestyle, in your words, in the way that you love. The best hope for someone to understand the love of Jesus is that they would experience it from you. The best hope for someone to experience the grace and the goodness of God is that they would experience that grace from you. And so you and I are called to not just be this collective church attending thing, but that when we leave here, we see ourselves as the church, wherever God takes us, however He wants to use us, the collected and the scattered. Now let me illustrate this. I'll give you this kind of image that you and I can, all right, what do we do practically? If that's the church, if that's our part, what do you and I do practically to go be like that? Let me give you this image of this is a beach towel. And this beach towel is made by a company whose name I can't really say. They're out of Paris, like over 100-year-old design firm. They're super famous and made a ton of money in making these like really fancy, expensive silk scarves. Then they got into making luxury towels. I didn't know if you knew that was a thing, but it is. This towel is 36 inches by 60 inches. It is 100% cotton terry cloth, and you can purchase one of its many designs and colors for a small price of $530. That's right. Now, there are some of you in the room who are like, heck yeah, I would be honored to own such a treasure, right? And there's most of us who are like, you're an idiot, whoever did that, right? That's a towel. That don't make any sense to most of us. Now, that's one towel. Let me give you, just by contrast, an example of a more normal towel, right? This might represent the more kind of normal towel many of you have, right? It's like you paid $1 for it at the dollar store. It's more like sandpaper than, yeah, it's more like drying off with a hand cloth than like a whole towel, right? They're not great, but it's reusable and it's far more practical. Now I want you to picture this image because this is the way to picture what following Jesus and being the church where we live, work, and play looks like. This is the image Jesus set for us in the moment where He had His final kind of teaching opportunity with His disciples. That you and I would see a towel as something that is very representative of what it is to not just believe Jesus, but be like Jesus. So, picture Jesus. This is the Thursday night. It's kind of late. He's come back to Jerusalem. He's stirred up quite a commotion, his teaching, his table turning over in the temples, his very, very like harsh critique of the religious authority. They had already hated Him and they wanted Him gone, and yet He rode right into town in the time of Passover. People hailed Him as the future king of Jerusalem just days earlier. It's Thursday night. It is late. Within 24 hours, Jesus will be dead. And everything those people who had been following Him and had put their faith in, they will feel like has been lost. As they gathered in this upstairs space, Jesus and His 12 disciples, to not just have their last dinner together, but a very important sacred ritual dinner called the Passover that reminded the Jewish people of their identity, of God's faithfulness, and of His miracle working power in the story of the Exodus and Moses and Pharaoh and let my people go. And that night at dinner, Jesus would do a couple things that were very shocking. One of them was He would go off script of the Passover and say, this whole story and everything that it is pointed to is about to find its fulfillment in me. But before He would do that, Jesus would take on the role of a servant and put a towel over His arm and teach you and I that the real image of following Him is not to be towel wearers, but to be a towel bearer in the life of the people that He places around us. Now, earlier in that day, the disciples, as they had been accustomed to, got into an argument about which of them is the best of the disciples. They would get into this argument. In fact, multiple times Jesus would say, hey, I'm going to be handed over, beaten, crucified, and died, but not stay dead. And they'd be like, all right, but which one of us is the best, Jesus? Like, read Mark 9 and 10. They do it constantly. When you read it back, sometimes, I don't know if you ever do this, you read this and you're like, were they dumb? And then you go, wait, am I dumb? Like, do I do this too? They're arguing about who will be the greatest. And so Jesus stands up, and what he had done the other times, they'd had this argument, because he would launch into a little sermonette and he would teach them. He'd say, hey, the last will be first. So no, the greatest is the servant. And this night, there was no time left for more teaching and sermons, and so what he did was he modeled for them what it actually looks like. So he stood up and he put a towel over his arm and he began to wash their feet. And you can imagine the awkwardness as the room went silent, and these status-seeking disciples who were more concerned about themselves than about all that their Messiah was about to do bent down and washed their dirty, nasty feet. And when it was all over in John chapter 13, verse 14, Jesus said this, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. As followers of Jesus, this is our calling. Not to wear towels, not to own luxury towels, but that we would be towel bearers, we would be servants, we would be foot washers. This is who we're supposed to be. So what does it mean to be a towel bearer? I'll give you two kind of things from this story in John 13. The first is that towel bearing, to do it well, means you have to learn to not worry about who it is that you're serving, but why you're serving and whose example you're following. So back up to verse 2 of John 13. This is what happens at the beginning of the story. It says, in the evening, the meal was in progress. So they're going through this Passover meal. They're starting to eat, which means the feet should have already been washed. The devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Now think of this for a moment, how significant this is. Jesus is sitting with his 12 disciples who he's spent more than 3 years with, pouring his life into, teaching, modeling, calling them to become like him. And it's these 12 that he wants to take all that he's about to do and put it on their shoulders to go launch the movement of Christianity. In 24 hours, he will be crucified. He sits at that table with Judas, who he knew was going to betray him, and yet he served him. You go around that table, one of the other guys there is Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends. Jesus is going to serve Peter and wash his feet, even though Peter, before the sun would rise that next morning, will deny even knowing Jesus or being associated with him for fear of his own life. Those other 10 sitting there, they would all absolutely lose their hope and feel devastated the next day and abandon Jesus and thought, well, we just wasted 3 years of our life following the wrong dude. Jesus knew this. And I think the question when you read that story, you and I should ask ourselves is, what would you do sitting at that table? What would you do if an opportunity to serve presented itself to a group of people you know will hurt you? Not just that they have hurt you, they will hurt you. They will disappoint you. They will fail you. I mean, what would you do? Especially if you had the powers of God. I don't think I would serve them. I think I would serve them up, like some Jedi Force thing. And yet Jesus knelt down and he began to wash their feet. It's tough to be a towel bearer when you feel like you are serving people who might take advantage of you or have or who will. It's tough to serve a husband who is never thoughtful of you. It is tough to serve a wife who never stops to appreciate what you do for the family. It's tough to serve a kid who just thinks the whole world revolves around them and never has any gratitude for all that they have. It's tough to serve a coworker who's talked behind your back. It is tough to serve a neighbor who is always taking but never seems to give. It's tough to serve a dad who, no matter what you do, just never is quite good enough. It is tough to serve another church member who acts self-righteous and condescending. It's tough to serve when you feel unappreciated or unnoticed by the people who are around you. And for most of us, what we tend to do in those moments is fold up that towel and put it away. And like, hey, if this is how it's going to be, then I'll just worry about me and I'll worry about my relationship with God and forget the rest of you. We've all failed at that and done that, and yet what Jesus shows us is that being a towel bearer is not concerned with who you serve, just that you serve, because it is what he did and is what he calls you to do. And I'll show you the second thing that will kind of help unravel that a bit, is that to really be a towel bearer as Jesus, it's about learning not to get to be concerned with whether or not you're in the limelight or whether or not you get the credit. To be content to serve in the background, whether anyone ever notices, knowing who you're really serving is not the person, but the one that served you first. We'll jump to verse 3 of John 13. We'll read the next part of the story. It says this: Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So one of the very first things that enables us to really be a bearer of a towel like Jesus is that we know our identity. We know who we are and who we are in his sight. And when you really know who you are, that your identity is in him, your identity is not in what you do. It is not in what you accomplish, achieve. It is not in other people's praise and appreciation of you. It is not even in what you desire in this world. Your identity is in Christ. It was given to you in the creation account when you were woven together in your mother's womb, and it was redeemed upon a cross. And there's nothing that you need to do in this life. And there's no credit or praise or accomplishment or promotion that you can get in this life that has anything to do or can come close to who God sees you as and what he has called you to be. And when you really get that, then you can become a towel bearer like Jesus. So it continues, it says, so he got up from the meal. He took off his outer clothing. He wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water in a basin and he began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now this is kind of like easy to picture, but then not quite as humiliating and awkward of a moment this would be for every one of them. In those days, feet now are gross, but feet back then were way gross, right? Like they wore sandals their whole life, and they walked on dusty roads. Like it is nasty, right? Like super gross. And it is so customary to have someone, when you come into a home for a meal, to be honored, to be taken care of. Any form of hospitality began with someone washing and cleaning your gross feet as you came not only into their home, but to sit and to share a meal, because unlike us, they didn't sit at a high top and hide their feet underneath. They reclined at a low table where their feet were like right there with each other. And the fact that no one had done it yet meant everyone, like this was reserved not just for like the lowest of the hierarchy, but the lowest of the lows. This wasn't just like for servants, but even the lowest of the servants. They were the ones who washed the feet. And here Jesus sits on his last night in his last meal with all that he has taught them and tried to show them. And the 12 of them were all waiting for someone else to go first. Not one of them wanted to be the one seen as a lower than the other and a servant. See, all of us love the ideas of servanthood. None of us want to be treated like a servant. But to follow Jesus and to understand his love and the identity he's given us calls us to be one no matter how we are viewed. And here they sat asking, why should I? You and I do the same thing. Why should I serve? Why should I volunteer? There's a lot of needs in the church and a lot of things that it takes to be church. The Apostle Paul would always use this example of trying to help us see, like, we're like a human body. Like, to be the church is to see yourself as a part of a body. And if you don't play your part, the body is just always going to be anemic or crippled or less effective. I'll read just this one time that he talked about it in 1 Corinthians 12. He said this: just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. You and I have a role to play. We have a part to play. And if we don't do the part, it will just like make your spiritual journey stifled. You will never go as far. You will never fully understand God. You will never become all that he has for you. You will never live into the real peace and contentment if you keep making your life and your time and your money about you. Jesus says the one who really gains their life is the one who chooses to lose it. Like, be open-handed with it. Give it away. I'll show you another example of this in Ephesians chapter 2. It says, for we are God's handiwork, created by Christ Jesus to do good works, and God prepared in advance for us to do. Like, this isn't about how we need more volunteers at 242. This is about how you and I were created to be more than we are and to spend our time and our energy living into that calling. It is far too easy to underestimate the power of every one of us living into the calling of the good works that Jesus has created us for. You and I have the ability to play a part. Whether we hold a door, or we click buttons on a tech team, or we play an instrument, or we hold a baby, or we teach a student, whatever part we play to be the church, God has this way of using it all to help people take their next steps with God. I wanted you to hear a story of someone whose life's been changed from just a bunch of people that she'll never totally know or be able to thank, just being the church for her. This is Tiffany.
Basically, I grew up in I had a pretty good upbringing. Just we didn't really have a lot of like faith in our house. I grew up kind of as a troublemaker a lot, so I kind of put my parents through a lot growing up, and I always had like a lot of guilt for that. I kind of went through a period of time where I was switching what I wanted to do a lot, and I didn't really have any direction, and that's when I like fell into like a really depressed state. I felt like something was wrong with me because I couldn't get the kind of grades that I wanted, and I couldn't like stick to my goals that I had for myself. It was just, I felt a lot like everyone was around me was doing better than me. And that was the worst. I think that was the worst feeling, is like getting on Facebook and seeing like all of my friends doing all these great things, and me being like, well, I have something wrong with me, so I can't. I went to 242 with a friend because we were going to hang out after, and she was like, well, I want to go, let's go to my church first. And I was like, that's fine, you know, because it looks fun. And after that, we started going to church regularly on the weekends. When I look back at it now, I'm like, yeah, that was like where I think I started to turn things around, you know. For some reason, I'm like, I'm going to go serve. And I was such a new person at this church that for me, like, serving was kind of scary. I didn't know if I was like good enough to be serving, but I just felt so convicted to do it. I felt like these people like are so nice and they're so wonderful, and like they were so accepting to me, and like I just felt my life changing. And it wasn't like a I'm better now kind of change. It was definitely like over time, like certain things got easier in order for me to, you know, reach out to other people and help other people. And I still struggle with depression. It's something that I can accept that, you know, I'm gonna have some hard days. And when I do have those thoughts sometimes where I'm like, oh, I'm gonna suck at this or something, that's not God speaking, you know. Before Christ, I was lost and sad. And with Christ, I feel completely alive.
Isn't that awesome? Just simple. Yeah, you can clap. She's not here, but you can clap. Let me end by just reading what Jesus said at the end of this moment where he put on this towel and began to serve. In John chapter 13, starting verse 14, he said, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is his messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. You want to be blessed in life? It's not what you know about church. It's how you become church. You want to be blessed in life? It's not what you believe about Jesus. It's how you become like him. You want to be blessed? It's not what you know about the way Jesus served that night in his Last Supper. It's how you choose to embody that kind of lifestyle. And fortunately for us, we don't have to wash anybody's feet anymore. That's weird, and we stopped doing that. But what we can do is hold doors and show up early and set up and clean up and take care of babies and kids so parents can come into the service and have a distraction-free experience without them. We can serve on tech teams and bands. We can serve in 100 different ways. And we can play a part in what it is to be the church and play a part in someone else taking their next step as you and I take ours. And so we're going to enter into a time that we call Encounter, and we want to just give you a couple